From one of Australia's former leading homicide detectives, this is I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
Our editor, Gemma Jones, went to an event and Courtney Hunter-Heberman is a mother and she was speaking at the event. She gave her welcome to country and she said, if you think it's hard being a white woman in Australia, try being a black woman. And I think Gemma's really captured by that, and she approached Courtney after and, kind of just asked her, what's that all about? And Courtney's daughter Rose had died in 2019 in what Courtney believed were circumstances that she didn't feel were properly investigated. And that sort of sent us on this. That was the first case, and that's what we started investigating. And as we investigated, Courtney put us in touch with another mum whose daughter had died in circumstances she didn't feel were properly investigated. And then another one, and then another family got in touch with Doug.
I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
Today I had a conversation I wish wasn't necessary, but it's something I think we need to talk about. Today I sat down with Emily Olle and Douglas Smith. They're both hosts of a podcast series called Dying Rose and authors of a book of the same name. We talked about how families of Indigenous women found deceased were routinely let down by those responsible for finding out what happened to them. I thought this was a thing of the past, but it's still happening and it needs to stop. This is a conversation. This is a different location for an I Catch Killers podcast. We're on the floor of the Advertiser newspaper down here in Adelaide. Before I start, I'm just going to read out a listener warning. And the podcast addresses sensitive topics including murder and suicide, specifically of Indigenous women in Australia. We recognise that these discussions can be deeply distressing and may evoke strong emotions. Okay. Police officer has told an inquest she would have now done several things differently from when she investigated the death of a mother discovered being eaten by dogs. That's an extract from a media report of an inquest that's been held as we speak into the death of Lasonya Dutton in Wilcannia. These are the type of things that we raised when we last spoke, and you covered in your podcast series A Dying Rose and covered in your book A Dying Rose.
Yep.
Does it shock you that the police officer, the officer in charge, is making those type of comments?
Yes and no. I guess no, because as an Indigenous person myself, I kind of expect it. But at the same time, it kind of tells me that the system is still flawed. When we talk about, what came out of Barraville years ago, and then also when we look at this and then we look at all the recommendations, you can have so many recommendations to come out of an inquest or a parliamentary inquiry or whatever that is, but at the end of the day, if there's not a change on the ground and you can have these recommendations, you can see that over the years, that nothing really does change to the extent that it should. Indigenous voices still feel drowned out in these cases and in these situations, as we don't have any Indigenous homicide detectives. We don't have those Indigenous people working closely with homicide, or you have those Indigenous community liaison officers, and we can teach stuff of Indigenous culture in police forces or in any organisation or any institution. But at the end of the day, I think when we look at having more Indigenous people in, I guess, homicide itself or something like that, that might make a change, but I don't feel like they listen to us and our recommendations or any of those coronial inquests, parliamentary inquiries, whatever you'll say, Senate inquiries, and none of it really matters if it doesn't actually, if it's not taken seriously, because we'll continue to see what we continue to see now.
Not ticking and flicking.
I think, for us it's unsurprising because it's what Keith was telling us 3 years ago when we first spoke to him, Lasonya's dad. Yeah, when we first spoke to him, his concerns were that the right questions hadn't been asked, that the right people hadn't been questioned, that the investigation felt not properly supported, that it felt rushed. So I think to hear that stuff come out more formally in court by the people who were involved is unsurprising, because it's what he said. And
here it is playing out in an inquest, trying to find out what's happened. I'm saddened I'm sitting here speaking to you guys, and I say that with the greatest respect, but I'd like not to be having these discussions.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that, on the back of you identifying the issues that you saw in dying rows and things that have happened in the past, that we've learnt, we've changed, we've evolved, and these type of things wouldn't happen. But seeing it play out in an inquest contemporarily, like, it just brings it back to the fact that, we still haven't got it right. Just for the listeners, and I have had you guys on the podcast before, but just put in the perspective how you became involved in the Dying Rose project, which is a podcast series and also a recently released book.
Yep.
I mean, that story began at International Women's Day, of all days, which was, our editor, Gemma Jones, went to an event, and Courtney Hunter-Heberman is a mother, and she was speaking at the event, and she said, she gave her welcome to country, and she said, if you think it's hard being a white woman in Australia, try being a black woman. And I think Gemma was just really captured by that, and she approached Courtney after, and kind of just asked her what's that all about. And Courtney's daughter Rose had died in 2019 in what Courtney believed were circumstances that she didn't feel were properly investigated, and that sort of sent us on this. That was the first case, and that's what we started investigating. And as we investigated, Courtney put us in touch with another mum whose daughter had died in circumstances she didn't feel were properly investigated, and then another one, and then another family got in touch with Doug.
For me, it started, I used to work at National Indigenous Television, and a colleague of mine, Deanna, she'd been talking to Keith about, shortly after his daughter passed away, Lasonya, after she was found, my colleague had been speaking to Keith, and she needed someone with her to go to Wilcannia, and I put my hand up and I was like, let's do it. And that was back in 2022, probably in March. It was a month after that, and that's when I first went there. I kind of felt from the start that this was, a story that would, follow me in my career until we get some sort of answers for the family. And here we are 3 years later.
We ended up with these 6 cases that were hugely similar in the concerns that the families had about police not properly looking into, in their eyes, the circumstances of these really horrible, tragic deaths of their daughters.
You see that more than a coincidence? Like we're talking, 6 Indigenous women, and the families all had the same concerns.
Yeah, and some of the concerns is the way police behaviour, I guess, responding to their situation, whether it's a death, and in Indigenous communities it's anything really, but particularly in these cases, obviously it's death. So the way that the police had responded to these families was quite, I don't know what to say. I put it into words really. In one case, that it was ruled the family were comfortable that it was a suicide, but the police got there, and instead of helping the family, they arrested the brother and bashed him. It was bad while the daughter was on the ground getting resuscitated. The response the police have for our community is just terrible at times, yeah. I
think that's kind of what these were 6 cases, but we were only scratching the surface of, as was shown, there was a Senate inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations women and children that you were a part of, and we learned of that inquiry through our 2-year investigation into all of these cases. It became clearer and clearer that this wasn't just isolated incidents of police, maybe one officer not looking properly into something. It was a systemic issue that these families and the families who gave evidence to the inquiry, and huge amounts of other families that we didn't speak to, as Doug says, felt was a systemic approach from police towards Indigenous people in lots of circumstances, as you say, but particularly when it comes to deaths that they felt were suspicious.
Okay, let's talk about Lasonya's case. Can you give us a background to the circumstances in which Lasonya disappeared and where she was found?
Yeah, so Lasonya, 31-year-old Barkindji woman from Wilcannia in central west New South Wales. She was on...
Body discovered on March 29th.
So 4 days before that, right, so it was a Friday, and she'd been having a few drinks with her 2 close cousins. They were in this place like in Wilcannia, it's called they call it the safe house. So it's where women usually live for, you know, escape domestic violence or whatever. And she was there, and they were sitting down during the day having a drink. She's taken off at about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the afternoon. She's walked away, and she said to all of her, you know, family, "I'll see you later, my mob, my family, I'll catch us tomorrow." And she said she was going home, but she went, and no one saw her after that. Apparently, on that night, she was seen at another house in the Mallee. That's a part of the community where, you know, mostly Indigenous people live. She was seen at another house with someone, and they were drinking. And then they were there till late hours of the night, and they've taken off. No one's seen them after that. So she's taken off Friday night. No one's seen her on Saturday. No one's seen her on Sunday, Monday. And then on Tuesday morning at about 10 o'clock, that's when her body was discovered in the backyard of her own home. And like I said before, it was just metres away from the back door, the back kitchen window, right next to the clothesline. And up into this yard, and this yard it's actually where she was found, is probably 2-3 metres away from like a backway path that people just use. Like, they don't even live in that house, they'll just use that path to like walk through to the next street, so they don't got to go the whole way around. So that yard is constantly visited throughout the day, and it's Lasonya's grandmother's house, Nana Norm. She's a big matriarch there for the family.
People drop in.
People drop in, have a cuppa, you know, sit down, have a yarn. That's where a lot of people go, and it's just, for the whole community, it's like, well, I'm pretty sure she wasn't there yesterday, and I'm pretty sure she wasn't there the day before. How's she there today?
And can I ask how her body was found? Like,
it had an electrical cable wrapped around her neck. It was an Xbox 360 cord, like an audio-visual AV cord, and I think like she was found with that wrapped around her neck. She was in an advanced state of decomposition, so she'd been dead for about, well, they said around 4 days, 3 to 4 days, because of the state of her body. So she had been laying there for that long, and there were dogs chewing at her, and she'd been missing some limbs, and, you know, it looks like they'd been there a while. And, you know, when her uncle just walked in the backyard one morning and just found her there, and he was like, he told me, he goes, I thought it was a kangaroo at first. But then I looked again, and he goes, then I realised it wasn't a kangaroo, it was my niece. And he was just, you know, screaming his head off when he saw that.
I can imagine how horrific it would have been for him. Was she reported missing before her body was found? Had anyone made the inquiries? Where was she living? Where was she staying?
She was at that house where she was found. In like Wilcannia, you know, and like even. And
I asked that question provocatively because I want you to explain that, because people will be going, but if she didn't come home, but explain the community. Yeah, like in Wilcannia, in my community as well. If I went missing for a couple of days, like, he's probably just over at cousin's house doing something, you know, like he's just staying there. Like, we don't think of it in that manner. Like, we don't think of it like, something really bad is wrong here. Like, something is really wrong here. Like, and I could see how the family didn't see that straight away, because, you know, Wilcannia is like, you know, she might be off at cousin's house, or they went down to the river, or they were doing something. Like, that's just normal for outback country life, you know? And so in this case, like, no, she wasn't reported missing. And I don't think they would have reported her missing unless... Well, I don't think anyone in that community would report someone missing unless they had a really, really bad feeling that it was wrong, and that they had to go to the cops to say something. Yeah. And I don't think that they felt that. And because to them, that's just normal living. And, you know, it's just same in my community. Like, my brother goes missing for 3 or 4 days sometimes, and I'm like, where the hell is he? You know, it's just like, he's at the mission doing something. You know, like, it's the same thing. Okay, so the first involvement or notification of the police is when Lasonya's body has been found. Yep. They've contacted the police. It's found by her husband, her uncle, Merle, and he's got in contact with the police. Then, as my understanding, homicide detectives local police would have come out. I'm just surmising here, but I know from the report that homicide detectives attended that day, so they would have flown up. I'm very cautious this matter is before an inquest, and the coroner hasn't handed down findings at this point in time. So what we're talking about here is what's been reported at the inquest and reports that have come from the inquest. The inquest, my understanding, has been held at Wilcannia. Okay. Some of the things that come out that have caused me concern when you've had the officer in charge of the investigation in the witness box said that she wasn't even aware initially that she was in charge of the investigation. Is that correct? And she has also expressed, as I read out at the start of the podcast, that would have done things differently. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, flawed system when it comes to, historically, when we look at other cases like this, I go back to Barraville again, my take is nothing has changed enough. We're looking forward, we're fast forwarding here, and it's like what's been identified as, gaps and police have done the wrong thing or, unintentionally, missed things in the past because either they're unconscious bias, they're like, oh, it's, that's probably not something that we need to look at or whatever, blah, blah, blah. That is still playing out, as we've talked about. That will bring it forward to this police officer, right? Unaware that they were, because where was the communication within the police force or where was the organisation to get a proper task force there or, team of homicide detectives to look at this properly? I mean, thoroughly, right?
Well, I also think it speaks to the difference as well. I think there's a couple of factors at play. The remote community is massively a factor, but also, if a white woman's body was found decomposed being eaten by dogs in the middle of the Adelaide CBD, there would be streets blocked out. There'd be hundreds of cops crawling the streets. I think that those concerns that she's raised about that response, the fact that, there was a fairly junior constable at the scene is pretty baffling given the circumstances that she was found in.
Breaking it down, and this is me joining the pieces from an ex-homicide detective, understanding the workings of New South Wales Homicide Squad and what's been reported in the media from the inquest into Lasonya's death. A homicide have attended, if we accept how it's been reported in the media on the day, so I'm assuming they either flew up or drove up the moment they were notified. So that's a tick. The first mistake you could make is we won't send homicide. There's nothing to see there, and that could potentially be where a problem is. So the first step is right. They've sent a homicide team up there. They're treating it seriously initially, but there's also reports of the lack of CCTV footage gathered. I think it was at the club or the location she was drinking at on the Friday, but only the CCTV footage from that period of time was gathered. From a homicide investigation point of view, it's crucial, the last sighting. The last sighting is basically your starting point to do the investigation. There seems to be some problems there. Is that your take on it?
I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that was raised in the inquest is that Lasonya's ex-partner was asked to provide CCTV for the 4-day period that she was missing. And when that he was handed a USB stick and he gave it back. And when that CCTV was handed over, Friday night and Saturday morning and all of Monday that were missing.
Okay.
And, I think that the detective said that she kind of brushed that off as a technical issue or, there's all sorts of reasons that the footage could be corrupted. But, having spoken to Keith, who's got so many doubts about the way that this was approached, something like that only raises more questions, because when you've got an incomplete picture, for whatever reason, it could be completely innocent. It could, it could absolutely be the file was corrupted, but you then sort of open that door to questions being asked that now can't be answered because that hasn't been provided. And I think that that's one of the things that we're now seeing play out in this inquest is all of the concerns that the family had that, maybe corners had been cut or things hadn't been sort of properly looked into seem to be coming somewhat to fruition.
Well, and we're getting this because the police are actually under oath giving evidence, and this is where this information is flowing out. Up until that point, correct me if I'm wrong, when you guys were looking at and you're making inquiries with the police and the response you got back, well, you explained to me the response.
I got the same response a year apart, I think it was. It was the exact same response from the cops. There was any questions, any assertions that we put to the police from the family, their concerns, none of it was answered. They had a strike force there and they were looking into this death, and that they had spoken extensively with the family, and that was it. There was no other, nothing from the cops. I even went to the cop shop in Wilcannia to speak to the cops, and that was a bit of a tense moment itself, but Nothing at all. No.
We actually, at the end of the podcast process, ended up dubbing it the Wall of Silence because we had cases across different states and territories, and each of the police institutions that we approached came back with much the same responses, which were no comment. Or, we're investigating, or we've spoken to the family, but, we weren't really given any sort of insight into those processes.
Yeah, and look, playing devil's advocate, the police could say it's an ongoing investigation, we can't speak to the media. Yes, you can go down that path occasionally, but I've spoken more detail to you guys and seen the response, and it was a generic sort of bland response that gives no comfort to the family or to yourselves investigating it from a journalistic point of view that things have been done. And I've got to say, and you were predicting this 2 years ago. When you were saying it, the family were saying they got concerns, and now we've got police officers in the witness box acknowledging that things could have been done differently, and getting emotional about the way the investigation's been done. The USB that was provided to the ex-partner, and I think we'd need to clarify that he's not considered but publicly he's not considered a suspect in this matter, but the police thought it important enough to gather CCTV footage from his place, and they've provided him a USB stick, and it's come back and there's significant portions of the footage missing. From a homicide detective's point of view, that would cause me concern. Now, there's technical glitches that you can have in computers. What's your take on that?
I mean, I guess it's hard not to look at that and have questions. I think any person would look at that and, whatever the reason, it just creates questions. You go, well, why was that portion missing? What happened during that time? Is there something that we're missing? And I think that, particularly for her family, you will always have questions. Those sort of things are what spiral into those questions of, well, what are we missing?
Yeah.
What's not being provided? What's not being said?
It's also because they're missing in specific times where we really are looking to know what happened on those days or where she was on those days. And again, we're not saying that this person is, in any way, the person that's done anything to her, but it's just that it raises questions, right? It just raises so many questions because the specific or the times of where that footage is missing is really concerning.
Yes. Yeah, and you would have to get to the bottom of it. I wouldn't be as overly concerned if the police were in the witness box at this inquest and said, yes, there is footage missing. We've provided the USB stick and we've examined the computer and it shows that there was a technical difficulty between this period and that period. But what I'm getting, and I preface that with only reports from the media, there's been no explanation on why that's forgotten. The officer in charge also made a comment, and I'm just looking for it here. I haven't got the specific quote, but it was along the lines. The officer in charge was. I saw it, and this is my interpretation of it. I saw it as her saying, "Well, it was all a bit confusing, the structure of who was leading the investigation." You're out. I'll call you guys outsiders. I understand the organisation, the way things work. With that type of commentary, does that cause you concern?
Oh, massively.
Absolutely.
I mean, look, and again, it's not, and at no stage I think is anyone putting any, and nor should they put any blame on this officer.
Yeah.
When you're, it's hard to imagine in a circumstance, allegations of murder is the worst crime. So it's hard as an outsider to understand why you wouldn't have a pretty solid set of systems and processes in place when a possible, even a whiff of murder or homicide or suspicious circumstances is raised. How someone could walk into that scene and be like, I'm not really sure who's supposed to be looking at what here. I find it pretty hard to fathom, really.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that they would just rock up and know. I mean, as a police officer, right? I mean, if it was as if it was a case here in Adelaide or in Sydney, that would probably be the case, right? They'd rock up. They would know who's in charge, who's doing what. You would set us how do you think you would run an investigation of that manner or that type? You would be the lead. You would be the lead homicide detective, right?
I know, and there is experienced officers and inexperienced officers. I know from experience how you run investigations, and there's a clear structure and things need to be set in place. So you don't want to see a police officer in the witness box acknowledging mistakes were made in an investigation where the family have been flagging. We got concerns about the way this is going to be investigated from the outset. You've got you guys doing stuff in the media, expressing concerns and the very concerns that you've expressed. And then fast forward, we get to the inquest and the evidence that is coming out of the inquest, and we preface that with the coroner hasn't handed down the findings, so this has just been reported. You've got all this concern about the way the investigation is being conducted. I see that the homicide detective also gave evidence at the inquest, and the homicide detective said, I didn't have concerns about Broken Hill or Barrier Police District being able to carry out the investigation, she told the court. Again, then you've got the local police saying, well, would have done things differently. So there's a failure without putting blame on the individuals, because I don't think anyone sets out to not do an investigation properly. But there's a failure there somewhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like in a newsroom, right? If you have your big breaking story of the day, you're not sending your cadet out to do it.
Yeah.
And if you are, you're making sure that you've given them all of the training, all of the advice, you're checking their work, you're making sure that someone experienced is looking over that. So I think, it's hard to understand how someone could look at, and again, it's not speaking to the skills or the capabilities of any individual officer, but it's hard not to look at that and go, well, why was it just a matter of, okay, they've got it, seems good enough, no worries.
Well, looking from the outside, the investigation, this is me speaking with the benefit of hindsight, but based on years of experience as a homicide detective. Crucial that you would lock in the person that found Lasonya's body, details of where you were, who was around the house, all that, a statement. Her last movements would be crucial. In this day and age, that's quite often CCTV footage, so that's a high priority. Interviewing people and following up those type of investigations. I got to say, from looking from the outset, bearing in mind the coroner hasn't come back with the findings yet, that doesn't appear to be the case.
I can say that I've spoken to people that, as I think about it now, because I did mention before, when she left on the Friday night, no one really knew where she went, but there were actually people that reported sightings of her late into the night, and police never spoke to them, as far as I'm aware, because I know cops went back a second time. It was in 2023 that they'd gone back there. They'd conducted, I don't know how many interviews after it, but they'd gone back to have a second stab at this case, right? But before that, there were a few people that had seen her late in that night, who said that they'd seen her late in that night walking along the main street at the local football oval. None of them cops had never gotten a statement from any of them. And I'd spoken to one of them and he was like, no, cops never came to me and asked me any of these questions, eh?
I think one of the ones that, I think we struggle with is Merle, her uncle, who discovered her body. He says he was never questioned by police. And to me, I don't understand how the first person to discover the body could have never been asked the question.
No, well, it can't be. And look, people might think, we're sitting here, we're beating up on the investigation that's before the coroner. The families flagged this.
True.
You guys flagged it. You spoke to me about it. I had concerns, and that's why I say I'm sitting here wishing I wasn't sitting here talking to you, because I'd like all those concerns. No, the police have done a thorough job, and the family now know what happened to Lasonya. But that hasn't been the case, and that's why I want to talk about it. That's why I wanted to sit down with you guys and talk about it, because how many times are we going to let this happen? And how can you have confidence in an investigation if you've got a family member that's died? How can you have confidence in an investigation when you've got police acknowledging that they could have done things better? I'm all for admitting we make mistakes. We all make mistakes time and time again. But these are pretty simple things that should have been done and should have been properly. Not blaming the individual officers, but what's the structure that this is allowed to happen, given the fact that there's been warnings about this, let's call it from the Barraville time, because the Barraville time should have changed the landscape. We should not be making these mistakes, and that's why I'm so passionate about it. I think, well, stuff this. We identified all the problems back there, and look what's happened there, and here we are 30, 35 years
later.
down the track, and we're still making those mistakes. So,
well, it's 30 years later, and we've got a book filled with. We'll take out Shannara because the circumstances of her death, but the same thing, the response to her death. 30 years later, and we've got a book filled with the stories of 6 families who have gone through essentially the exact same thing as the families of the Bowraville cases.
Yep.
let's talk about the Senate inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations women and children. Do you guys know how that came about, or what generated that, how that inquiry started?
Do, but it's been so long since I've covered it that I'm actually having a mental blank.
Not the specific individual that initiated, but I think it was because of all the dramas. It was collectively like one situation after another that, it was decided that the Senate inquiry, and they don't have a federal Senate inquiry lightly. Statistically, just if we look at things from a statistics point of view, have you got a focus on the statistics of murdered Indigenous women or missing Indigenous women? Yeah,
I mean the rates are, I think on average, it's about 8 times higher for Indigenous women, murder rates. Yeah. In Western Australia, it's actually about 17.5 times higher than non-Indigenous women. And there's also a lot of other statistics that come into play. They're 4 times more likely to be hospitalised due to domestic violence, and 6 times more likely to die of family violence. And I think a lot of those figures as well, unfortunately, are the best that we can get, but the reporting around the deaths and the instances of missing persons, particularly in the cases of Indigenous women, is actually not... There's no solid reporting structures around it. So that's the best that we can glean of those stats, but there's still a lot of question marks about them. They could be higher. I'll
just say something, is those statistics themselves is right. So you've got, you talk about the one of suicide, then you talk about the one of family violence, domestic violence itself. So if a cop or a detective rocks up to a case, and they think, like Lasonya's, and that they might think, all right, suicide, or they have had that assumption in the back of their mind that this is probably a suicide. They should also have that other statistic in their head that, Indigenous women do experience domestic violence at higher rates as well. So it's like these two statistics themselves has she, done something to herself, or has someone done something to her? They both go hand in hand in a way. It's like that they're both something that should be in the back of a detective's mind when it comes up to these kinds of cases.
I think the part of when I gave evidence at the inquiry was talking about where assumptions are made, where a misunderstanding about things, and on that basis go down a path or ignore lines of inquiry. That's where problems often occur. The inquiry's terms of reference focused on missing and murdered First Nations women and children, sought to examine the extent of the problem, comparing investigative practices between First Nations and non-First Nations cases, examining systemic causes, the effectiveness of existing policies, and exploring actions to reduce violence and improve safety. After 2 years and 16 hearings, the Senate inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations women handed down its report. While important, it's not the moment of reckoning many of us had hoped for. So that is an extract. Again, and I think you guys mentioned it while we're just sitting here talking about it, that, okay, it's one thing to have the inquiry, but are people going to react to it? One thing I thought interesting, and I think there was a flow on, I haven't got the details here, but the important role that media play on it, play in this. Yeah. We identified here, sitting talking about it, and clearly the Senate inquiry have come up with the same view, that the media play a part, and we need, and we're sitting in a news office, so it's a bit embarrassing, but we need to play a part in it, working in the media, that these cases are not forgotten. These cases are focused. When someone's found in tragic circumstances, dead in a backyard, just near the family home, being eaten by dogs, you would think there'd be some attention to it. So, 31-year-old woman, and there wasn't. You said, Doug, you're up there and there was no one there.
Yeah, we were the first to report on it, I believe, NITV, that was, so there was none. And that's just crazy. I mean, we can talk about the remoteness of the community, but what's 2 hours away is Broken Hill, right? Yeah. They should have heard about this. I don't know if they did or not, but I didn't hear anything or read anything from that, from Broken Hill media, no.
Well, I think a really good example of that was one that we investigated as well here in South Australia, Charlene Warrior, who was missing for 9 days before her body was found. And it was only once the media got involved that it really, sort of kicked into gear. But I mean, it was when we looked at sort of even, and I think we have to, as you said, you have to admit your mistakes. And I think that we have to admit our mistakes as well as a media as a whole, that we didn't pick up on that case until much later down the track, because I think that you do see, I think those biases, and I think I mentioned earlier that it's not necessary, it's not just the police that have issues with biases, and I think we have to acknowledge that, we will see police releases put out about missing women, and I think there is a tendency and an unconscious bias to go, oh, well, it's an Indigenous woman, so I should probably turn up, or, and I think that's what happens. And I think that the media is just as complicit a lot of the time in not really focusing on those stories.
With the book that you've got and the podcast series, and I know you two are passionate about, and the whole team that you've worked on this, do you think we can make a change?
Oh man, that's a big one, eh? Like, I think only time will tell, to be honest. It's going to take effort from everyone, and I guess the media itself to have a look at itself in the way that they report, as Emily has said, that admit to your mistakes. I think the media do play a big role in not covering these stories properly, or giving it even attention as they would a non-Indigenous person. And one thing I did find as well was socioeconomic status does play a big role in, how much time media or police are going to spend in someone's case, So, and that's regardless of skin colour, I believe, as well. But it just happens that, unfortunately, for Indigenous women, it's more often, it's more common in our communities, and that we don't get that media attention, that we don't get that police response that, we desire, that we need, that is, to correct it, to make things, it just doesn't happen. So,
I think as well, particularly for audiences and particularly, as white people, I think that people can have a tendency when you have these conversations to feel like they're being attacked or they're being blamed for something, right? Like white people hear someone say, policing as an institution has racial biases, right? And white police officers might go, oh, but not me. And I think that it's really important for people, and something that I hope that can happen is to be able to separate out and go, this isn't an attack on me. Think that people need to separate out and go, just remove yourself. No one's having a go at you. You can acknowledge that we as a society and as Australia have made mistakes. We need to fix those mistakes. And the only way that you can fix those mistakes is to acknowledge that they have happened. And so I think that acknowledgement, and then that listening, and then that understanding, and then that change has to come right from the start of recognising that something is wrong in the first place.
Yeah, and I think what you've said is 100% correct. I think police have to also acknowledge that there has been problems in the past. I'm talking from a police point of view, and we've got to overcompensate for that. We're going to make sure we do it properly, because time and time again we've shown that we haven't done it properly, and it's just not good enough.
I could tell you that sitting in that Senate inquiry the day that we did, the head of the New South Wales Police Force was there, the homicide squad, and they didn't really admit to anything like wrongdoing on their side, on their part. Nothing was really, they hadn't made that many mistakes. Or when it comes to, like, how do you deal with this case? They always bring up cultural sensitivity training. We do enough cultural awareness training that it's like cultural awareness training is not going to solve a murder, right? So it's like, and then they even asked the head of this homicide squad, or how many Indigenous people do you have in the homicide squad? He couldn't answer that question. And it's also, there was one big question, I think it was, is do you think that, I don't know if Senator Dorinda Cox asked it or not, was there racism, was it rife in the New South Wales Police Force? And no, like they were just saying no, like straight up, like but there was no room for them to say it is, but it's, we're trying to address, like it was just no, it was, they don't want to admit to it, right?
And that's one of the criticisms of the recommendations of the findings from the Senate inquiry, was that they didn't go far enough. Senator Dorinda Cox came out and said, one of the main ones was the Police Ministers' Council to review existing police practices towards First Nations people, right? Sure, that is important, but, I think that even then a Senate inquiry is being held within a system, within a, system that was created by white Australia to cater to, I think until there's that across the board recognition that, hey, we have made mistakes. We have all made mistakes as a society. We are going to acknowledge them and we're going to do something about them. Until police, senior police officers can sit in front of an inquiry and say, yes, we acknowledge that, you don't really see how you move forward in a meaningful way.
And what saddens me about that, when we had the Bowraville parliamentary inquiry and the recommendations that came out, one of the first recommendations was training and education of police, but they went further to say, not we all sit in a room and watch a PowerPoint presentation. And we all know that. Like if they do the training here in the media, you just sit there and nod. They wanted something that was meaningful. And they created a training film with me narrating it, speaking with the passion, speaking with the anger about what happened in Bowraville. And so people should watch that to change that culture. And we've got to push police, and not just police, if we're educating everyone. You don't just learn just sitting there and going, okay, cultural competency and awareness. It's got to be lived experience, and you've got to see it, how this impacts. So, problems that occurred. What happened? Well, someone has still got a way of murdering 3 children in the Bowraville case. So, it's definitely something that we need to fix.
It's also, it's interesting you mention anger as well, because I think that's something that, the response when, and it's journalism 101, that when you want someone to, you don't use statistics to get someone across the line. You put a face to a story and that's the case study. And I think when people saw the cases that we presented in Dying Rose, there was outrage. People were like, how could this be happening under our noses? And I actually think in this instance, that's what people should be feeling. There should be anger and there should be outrage that these systems are still failing these people in this way.
Well, I know what you're saying. It's probably not a good terminology, but you need to hit people over the head with a baseball bat to get it in. But what I say with Bowraville, like I can talk about Bowraville, day in, day out, and people go, yeah, that's terrible. And I say, okay, if the police responded properly when the first child disappeared, Colleen Walker, the other 2 children could quite possibly still be alive to this day. So that's the consequences if you don't do an investigation properly. Does that bring it home hard enough? Do you understand now? So that's the type of thing. And as I said, we all make mistakes, and here we are. I'm criticising the cops and the media. The cops hate me, the media hate me. You're criticising the media. We're stuffed. But it's an important thing, and unless we push it, it's not going to change. And
got to have those hard conversations, and that's in all aspects of life. In Australia, I believe, politics, when it comes to that, or media, or whatever it may be, having hard conversations about it and acknowledging your fuck ups. Say that, but acknowledging it and then working to fix it. That's what needs to be happening more often.
Okay. I'm going to ask you this question, and forget I'm a former cop and homicide detective. I'm asking you guys, why do you think this occurs?
Big question. I guess one of, and I can only speak to what I learned through this process, and Doug can speak much better to, lived experience. But I think that there's a series of issues in sort of entrenched biases, and it's not just within policing. I think it's within society more broadly, but entrenched biases towards Indigenous people on a lot of fronts, in terms of rates of suicide, murder, rates of domestic violence. I think that there is this underlying, and it's not necessarily a conscious bias. I think there's plenty of conscious racism within the police force, but I also think there's this sort of underlying unconscious bias in the way that a lot of police officers approach cases involving Indigenous people, and that clouds the way that they feel that they need to investigate them. And then there's the other layer that we sort of touched on as well, and that you've spoken about previously, is media interest. And, I think the media plays a role in putting a lot of pressure. Cleo Smith in WA was a great example of when the media gets involved, a little girl who went missing and was found. When the media gets involved and that pressure's put on, police step up because they know they're under the spotlight. A lot of these cases don't get media interest. And so I think that there is kind of, again, maybe an unconscious feeling that police go, oh, well, you know, we did our best.
It could even, and I don't disagree with what you're saying at all on that, but human nature, if you're not being pressured to do something, that, okay, well, if I don't attend to it today, I can do it tomorrow, pull it off. Well, no one's actually asking, and it gets shelved in the too hard basket, or you're just touching the surface and not doing it properly. I, as I said, I hoped with what happened with Bowraville and the things that were said, and I thought there were some watershed moments that, you know, where the police, we had the Commissioner come up and actually apologise. Commissioner Scipione came up and apologised to the Bowraville community and acknowledged that we could have done it better back when the children disappeared. But the fact that there's still these situations going on, and you said you just scratched the surface in regards to the 6 cases that you identified in Dying Rose. I can say here, I get phone calls from people that are expressing the same concerns from across the country, not just New South Wales, that these matters aren't being looked at properly. Having put the effort into the podcast series, which congratulations to, I believe it won a Walkley Award.
It did, thank you.
Which is a prestigious award. I've learnt that in the time I've been working in the media. You've done well. I've heard a lot of good journalists going, I want a Walkley, but you guys have actually got it. I say it's almost sad in a way that a Walkley Award winning podcast series and still perhaps a message didn't get out there. Do you find that? Because I found that on the Bowraville thing where you think, okay, it's on 60 Minutes, on Four Corners, it's on NITV, people are going to listen, but it just sort of slips away.
I think it's an issue that I guess Australia itself, like as a whole, you know, we don't really identify with it completely. Like it's not something that, you know, that's an issue that we need to address. Like that's something that we should be working, like we should all be collectively trying to, you know, make that a better situation for families. Like that's not something, you know, and like your question before is, what do you feel it is? It's like, it's, for me, it's the history of this country as well. It's the history of policing in Australia, and it's the history of relationships between policing and Indigenous people, and that's always going to be, you know, a bit of a shaky relationship no matter what. And this type of stuff is, you know, it shows that it's still there. You know, what happens in Dying Rose is because there's no communication between the Indigenous community and the police to the level that I think there needs to be, especially in my community where I'm from, and you know, we see a lot of issues there as well. But it's also, you know, I've grown up with police, you know, knocking on my door all the time. I've, you know, been arrested as a teen myself. You know, I've had police slag on me, call me a bung, a nigger. You know, I've had that happen to me. Like I've had racist police at me since I was about 10 years of age, and for no reason at all. I could tell you that. And I responded in a way, whereas I hate the police now because I'm only a young Aboriginal kid, and the way that they've treated me, and I've been traumatised from the cops, like, believe me, and I've had to sort of fight back. And how do I fight back is with, you know, doing the wrong thing. And that's because, you know, if I would have had a good copper walk up to me and treat me good as a kid, I wouldn't have saw him as, you know, the enemy growing up. And I'm not saying the enemy, I'm just saying, like, that's how it felt. And that's how it feels in Indigenous communities. Cops aren't there to help us, they're there to police us. And that's how it's always going to feel with us. Yeah,
and that communication breakdown, it can go both ways. Like the police will be, you know, they'll have their point of view, you've got your point of view. And I think that presents part of a problem with these investigations too, where that communication isn't forthcoming between the two groups. But I say that with the fact that you're the police. You're there to serve the public being everyone in the community, not selected people you want to help. So what we saw with Dying Rose covered in the book and the podcast is this, and you described it as systemic type of situation. Doug, you're talking from a black man's point of view and the relationship between the police. That all plays a part. How do you guys, I'll talk about my thoughts on it from a homicide or ex-homicide detective's point of view, how do you guys think it should be fixed? What would you like to see? Like when this came out, do you think the world would change? And we'd all go, the cops would go, we get it now.
I thought there'd be a few more people nodding their heads and going, yeah, that is,
outrage,
you know, a bit of
and then
outrage.
we're gonna change.
And I think that's the thing that we saw is the response was massive. The listenership, the readership, the comments, the outrage. People were outraged. They couldn't believe that this was how these families had been treated. So I think we did get quite hopeful that, you know, there was this sort of rumbling that there would be a bit of pressure put on, and then there kind of wasn't. And I think that there's, you know, a lot of ways to address that. And, you know, I can't speak to the best ways for the police as an institution to address that. That's something that people far smarter than us can, you know, come up with ways. But I think, you know, communication understanding is a starting point. I think the media has a huge role to play in coverage of these issues, in continuing to bring them to light. And I think particularly, you know, we've got amazing services like NITV, but it shouldn't just be up to Indigenous people to tell the stories of Indigenous people. It's the same as police. You know, police are there to serve all of the public. The media is here to serve all of the public. And I think we need to do a better job of being more aware of which stories we're choosing and, you know, which ones we're bringing to the fore and, you know, drawing attention to make people realise.
Get that awareness.
Yeah.
I think from a policing point of view too, there should be sort of, you call it affirmative action, or understanding that if you're investigating the death of an Indigenous person, you've got to look at things a little bit differently and treat things a little bit differently. Not, it's the same rule for everyone. We're not saying completely different practices, but understand that there's going to be a barrier to communication. Sometimes it's going to be hard. And I think Lasonya's father said that, you know, he was worried that because of his past history with conflict with police and the fact that he'd done time, that the police were just going to go, well, who cares? It's his daughter. That type of attitude, we've got to overcome that attitude, haven't we?
And I think that also comes from putting, you know, Doug, you've spoken before, like, you need Indigenous homicide detectives. You need to have that lived experience there to understand and build those relationships. And
obviously they've got to put their hand up for it, but I don't know, you know, what the situation it is with policing. And, you know, if, like, any Aboriginal police officer I know is usually a community constable. None are really sworn in officers to, you know, fully sworn in officers. I've known a few in my time. And I don't know how the police recruit and what they do there, you know, like maybe there needs to be a drive to push to get more Indigenous homicide detectives, because, you know, we know that there's a lot of death in our community, you know, and this book shows it. Well, you know, and what we've talked about just shows it really. So why wouldn't they get more Indigenous homicide detectives to trying to help with these cases? You know, like that is one thing. I think that's only one thing. Like, there's a whole lot of, like, and I think what you said about the media and what, you know, making that story a lot bigger for people to see, like, this is serious. Like, it's not just an Indigenous girl from the outback. This is actually a person, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of times where we're not really looked at as, well, I feel that we're not looked at as actual people when it comes to these type of cases. We're just another statistic. We're another statistic, you know, and because there's so many of it, or there's so much of it, we're just another statistic. Whereas, you know, we're not. Like, we don't want to be treated that way. You know, we want to be. We want the full investigation. You know.
You made me think there, Doug, about more homicide, Indigenous homicide detectives or different things. There's a structure you've got to go through to get to that position working in homicide. But when a homicide's set up in, I'm speaking for New South Wales, but I know it's pretty similar in all the other states around the country. A strike force is formed. So you bring in some homicide detectives, you'll bring in some general detectives. If it involves a child, you might bring in a child sex crimes detective. You'll bring in analysts. You bring in a whole range of people to form a strike force to investigate a death or a suspected murder. It lends itself. We have liaison officers in New South Wales and have similar things across the country. Potentially, and it just made me think while you were talking, you could, if I was heading up a murder investigation, let's say heading up this investigation into Lasonya, we could have had someone appointed to the strike force as the liaison officer, because we appoint family liaison officers when you've got a murder investigation. Someone that mightn't be the officer in charge, it might be person with the appropriate skills to liaise and keep the family informed, because there's a lot happening with investigations. Just made me think it's probably not a bad way that you could overcome those barriers of communication, understanding where the community's coming from and their distrust of police, that type of thing. So that's something that perhaps we should flag somewhere.
Like, you've got to change the perspective of young Indigenous people too, and you've got to do that by going in the community, learning the dynamics of the community, and working with Indigenous people.
Breaking those barriers down.
Yeah.